Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third video in week 11. This video will go over the second part of the Butera readings for this module. Now, Butera talks about how to write a broadcast story in terms of format, and a lot of the information overlaps with what you learned from the textbook reading. However, I think that Butera really provides an excellent kind of summary of what you read more in detail for the textbook. So we'll go over it a little bit again. He also uses a couple of different terms that we can discuss. So Butera has this idea that a broadcast story needs to be like a sandwich where the lead and the wrap up are pieces of bread and the body is really the meat of the story. So the lead is meant to be the introduction to the story for the audience. The primary purpose of a lead is to catch the audience's attention and to tell the audience where your story is going. Of course, there are many types of leads. We'll talk about a few of them from the Butera chapter here in a minute. But the lead is a really essential part of this story because it's what kind of provides the audience of a preview of what your story is going to be about. Now, the body contains the most relevant facts. It tells the audience the actual elements of the stories. And of course, this is the largest and longest element of the story. Finally, the wrap up is the end of the story. It's usually referred to as just the ribbon and bow that you tie to complete the package or the story. And it's really a reminder of what you've already told the audience, just summarizing things in a memorable way. Now, Butera also talks about the USU, which stands for Universal Specific Universal Storytelling. What this means is that a lot of broadcasters tend to start out with a large universal problem or issue. So, for instance, we could start out a broadcast story talking about COVID and the numbers for the state nationally. So, that would be, a national statistic that could catch the audience's attention, and it's universal across the United States. Typically, this is what your anchor will say before the reporter introduces the bulk of the story, but sometimes that universal issue is presented in the reporter lead. Then the story moves more specific. It kind of illustrates the universal issue by showing some kind of example from that. So you might start with national numbers and then talk about how Alabama's numbers are rising faster than other parts of the country. So now we've moved from national to state and it becomes more specific. Now you can become ultra specific by highlighting someone who tested positive in Alabama who maybe, had to be hospitalized or things like that. So that then becomes an ultra specific example that just applies to one person, but it's meant to illustrate the specific and universal issues presented within the story. So the final U is the ability to return back out to the larger universal issues. Now, sometimes we will end a broadcast story back on a specific example to bring resolution to the central characters. So if I had, talked about Alabama's COVID numbers and then presented someone who actually had tested positive, at the end of the story, we want to know what that person is doing now. So I would bring it back more specific for the resolution of the story to say, so and so has since tested negative and is doing well in their recovery to kind of provide that final resolution to the storytelling. Here's an example. So this story was pulled, I believe, from CBS 42, and it talks about how there is a concern in East Alabama about how to celebrate Halloween, given the recent rise in COVID numbers. And so it starts out with this universal issue. Note that it doesn't even tell us what neighborhood it is; it just gives us a very universal, generic East Alabama location. So then it says homeowners say whatever they do, they plan to be safe. Then we move into the specific. Now we know exactly what district of what city in East Alabama we're talking about, the Glenwood Terrace Historic District. And so then we get even more ultra specific by focusing on one person and their opinions. Here it's the name of the neighbor, who is McGee. And we talk about how she feels about it. Then we move back out to the larger neighborhood and then even wider back out to the United States. And of course, the story continues presenting opposite and balanced opinions from other people in the neighborhood, but this was just like the first 30 seconds of the story to demonstrate how we start universal, go in specific, go in even more narrow, and then come back out at the end of the story. So, Butera also talks about how to write lead sentences or lead paragraphs. And the lead, as with print media, is really meant to get the audience's attention. It sells the story and tells the direction that the story is going in. But for broadcasting, the lead is even more critical because you are fighting for attention, and it is harder to keep the audience's attention for broadcast than it is for print or digital. The thing to note is that when you're selling the idea or selling the direction of the story in the lead, you have to make sure that you fulfill whatever promise or direction you're telling the audience in the lead within the body of the story. So if you promise that, you're talking to residents of East Anniston who have conflicting opinions about this, but then you only present one opinion, you haven't presented the conflict that you promised in your lead. And so that would be a letdown to the audience who was expecting to see that controversy. So, in order to find a lead, here are the things you need to consider. And it comes back down to your news values that we learned about earlier in the semester. We need to know what is important and what is most interesting, what makes the greatest impact on your audience. We want it to be emotional or some ways that people can connect to on, an emotional level. And then, of course, we want to tell them what's in it for me. So when you find the information that meets one or more of these criteria, that is a good piece of information to use for your lead. Another important aspect to remember is that for broadcasting specifically, you want to make sure that you're localizing your lead to your audience's needs and continue to provide updated info because, print really was outdone by broadcast mediums because of its ability to keep people informed around the clock as opposed to having to wait for one daily press. So, being up to date and breaking in the news that you're presenting is an important aspect of broadcast media. Now, the lead can be many different styles. In fact, Butera lists more styles of leads than your textbook does. His are main fact, which includes just having one key idea. An umbrella lead tries to contain many facts within the story. A delayed lead creates suspense, but Butera says use this sparingly because when used inappropriately, it can be misleading. You can use a statement or a quote from an authority or someone who's been affected. But again, it's rare that one of our sources has a newsworthy enough statement that we could lead with it, although it does happen. We could ask a question to try to reach our audience and draw them in with questioning. But the problem with question leads is if I say, are you registered to vote? Well, if the answer is yes, then you're going to tune out. If the answer is no, you probably don't care. And so by asking a question, you've now divided and separated your audience, and people are going to start tuning out. So you have to use questions sparingly as well. And finally, using humorous leads to get an emotional connection to your audience has been used. But because humor is so subjective and it's really only good for soft news stories or very lighthearted stories, we want to use this type sparingly as well. So, other types of information that you need to know when you're writing a lead for broadcast news is to delay the name. This is a very common practice. As you watch more and more stories, you may begin to recognize this that unless a name is recognizable, like the president or the governor or a celebrity, It makes more sense to withhold the name of the person affected until the second or third sentence used. Instead, we might say, a Calera man was arrested today for, child abuse charges. And then in the second sentence, we're actually going to list that individual's name because unless you know that individual, you probably don't care what the name is in the lead. Instead, you really want to know more about the person rather than their name. Another important thing, as we've talked about, is updating the lead. And so you're wanting to emphasize the new information you've received about the case as part of your lead. This is especially true if you're running a story multiple times throughout the day, that you never want to present the same story written the same way twice. It's up to you to update the lead and rewrite it so it seems fresh and new for your audiences who are watching later in the day or listening later in the day. You also want to pull in new information or interview sound bites that have not been previously used in order to update that information. You want to avoid using continues updates like the investigation continues because we know the investigation is continuing. If it's any kind of criminal case, it's going to last more than 24 hours. So you're not really providing new information there. It's faking an update. Same with tonight. These are usually cliche or meaningless, like, the president is resting easy tonight after his debate with, the candidate Biden. We don't really care that the president is resting after the debate. So it really doesn't provide any new information. Also, you want to avoid segmenting your audience within your leads. Like, if you're afraid of COVID, don't go trick or treating. Well, what if you're not afraid of COVID? Then I'm not listening to the story. Or do you want to do X, Y, and Z? Well, if you don't want to do X, Y, and Z, you're probably not listening. So we want to avoid things that could potentially pull our audience apart or make them stop caring. In order to write the body of a broadcast news story, you're going to want to know how much time you have for the story. The broadcast medium is so well timed that any time and even a second that you go over on your newscast will cost your organization money. And so you have to be very careful in time. It's why writing concisely is so important. So if you have a 30-second story time slot, then you cannot write a 45-second story. You have to stick to 30 seconds. So that's going to determine how much information you put into the story. But you do want to make sure that in every story, even if it's just 15 seconds, you're answering the who, what, where, when, and why, and potentially how of that story. Don't try to overpack the lunch bag, though. You only want to focus on two or three important facts rather than trying to share all the information you possibly can. Instead, you can drive audiences to your digital platforms like your website or your social media to get more in depth coverage or information. You can also break a story apart. If you have a city council meeting and there are really five important things that come out of it, you don't want to cover all five things within that meeting. Instead, you want to probably have one story that talks about the meeting and its importance, and then have a couple of different sidebars to talk about the most important things that came out of it. So don't feel like you have to pack everything into one story. Instead, just separate them and let them be separate content. In order to write the wrap up or the tag, which goes at the end of your story, you're going to want to restate or summarize the most important aspects of the story. This is called a main fact tag. And this is usually just a restatement where you're not using the same words, but you're kind of summarizing what you've already said. There are some tags that provide an additional fact, so some new or interesting thing that you haven't talked about yet. However, that can be dangerous to do because usually by the end of your story, you're losing your audience's attention and focus. A differing opinion tag is when you're presenting something like maybe a court case, and then you listen to one source of information and your tag is presenting the other side of the story. So you could say something like, you know, the defendant's lawyer says that he's innocent, even though you've just presented the case that that he's guilty, according to officers. And so a differing opinion tag can be good in a story that deals with conflict or differing opinions. And so the what's next tag is also really good because it provides a look ahead at things that could be happening in the future. This is very common with court cases, like what's the next step, or issues of politics. So, what's next tags can provide new information, but information that looks ahead as opposed to information that you just hadn't said yet. Butera also talks about choosing sound that works well with your stories. And this will be important for you in your radio scripts because you'll need to interview at least one person and include their soundbite in the story. So, just as we chose interview segments or interview quotes for our print story, it's the same idea for radio or broadcast or television broadcast. You need to look for emotion, opinions, ideas, and unverifiable facts. Things that only your source can say because you are neutral and you are unbiased. You want to pick a soundbite that says something unique, significant, distinctive, or noteworthy, and they need to do it in a way that makes sense to the average audience. And we want to use sound bites that are conversational, that grab the listener's attention and add color or an interesting dynamic to your story. This is even more important in broadcast than it is for print because the tone of the source, the way that they say something, the emotion that they're sharing can sometimes be more powerful than the words that they are actually saying. However, we want to keep these sound bites short. You should never be using a soundbite. Well, I say never, but we should almost never be using a soundbite that's longer than 15 seconds because after that, you're going to lose the audience's attention. And there's very rarely something that a source has to say that takes longer than 15 seconds to say. But you need to have it be at least 5 seconds to give the audience enough bearing to know who is talking, who they are, why should I be listening, and actually clue into what that source is saying. So, the rule of thumb is that your interview soundbite should be between 5 and 15 seconds. Now, of course, this is a rule of thumb. I remember covering the Parkland school shootings, for instance, and having the president address the nation for, I don't know, I think the total sound bites would run 2 or 3 minutes. That was more important because in that moment, that source had more to say than I as a journalist did. So, those types of things, there are exceptions to the rule, but for what you're doing for your stories, you should try to keep them between 5 and 15 seconds. Now, writing into a soundbite is really important for broadcasting because instead of just using quotation marks, you are having to clue the audience in through your script that they are about to hear from someone who has a differing opinion. And they're going to hear the change in audio too, because instead of hearing your voice as the reporter or the anchor, they're either going to hear or see a totally new person in the report. And so we need to write a lead in to that quote that allows the audience to know what's going on. All lead in sentences should tell people who this person is, typically through the use of a title, their name, and a summary of what they're going to say. But we should not repeat the words that they actually use. We don't want to say, Daniel Devers says, I love your class. And then the quote that you hear me say as Daniel Devers is, I love your class. That doesn't make any sense. Instead, we could say something like, student Danielle Devers says she enjoys the educational perspectives available in the curriculum. I love your class, right? And so they work together, they blend together and bleed together by summarizing the words rather than using exactly what was said. Here are some examples of lead in sentences.
Success isn't just.
And we're going to get a nice commercial that we can watch before we do that. Do. Here we go. Oh no. Forgive me for the technical failings. We'll just
Success
listen
isn't
to it.
just about where you want to get to. It's also about how you get there.
And cut on rehearsal.
Harold Smith lives outside the levees, his town under voluntary evacuation orders, but he is staying put.
We've had 5, 6, 7 named storms, and every one of them 3 days out had my address as the bullseye.
In a historic storm
So
season,
you could hear the reporter describe that this person is a resident. He gives his name and he says he's staying put. And then we hear the actual source say why he is staying put. So it's almost like the lead in sentence of the reporter previewed what that bite was going to say. And then that bite, the sound bite or the source explained the why. Here's another example.
Seema Hernandez, the first in her family born in the U.S., wants to make sure they go to the polls.
There's too much at stake. There's too much at stake with this kind of president in office, with his dangerous rhetoric and his dangerous policies.
So, and please note that that was one opinion presented in a large package that had other opinions. So it's not as biased as it seems because I'm showing you just the one clip. But you can hear that they explain why this person's opinion matters because she's a first time voter, an immigrant, and she's encouraging the rest of her family to vote because she feels so strongly about not electing Trump in. And so the reporter uses the lead-in sentence to describe who she is, her name, and a summary of what she's about to say, but never uses the words she actually uses. So here's an example. If Katy Perry says, if knowing how to hire and fire people makes me a diva, then I'm a diva. In order to write the lead-in, I'm going to ask, who said it? Katy Perry. What did she say? Well, in summary, she's saying that she doesn't regret her business decisions and that she really doesn't care if people have a problem with hiring and how she hires and fires people. So, in order to write the lead in to this sot, I would say pop star Katy Perry says she's being unfairly judged for her business decisions. If knowing how to hire and fire people makes me a diva, then I'm a diva. See, I never use the keywords like hire or fire or diva from her quote in my lead in because that's her words. That's what I want her to say. Here's another example. If the Starkville mayor says these cameras are great for the city of Starkville, they're helping us monitor the city. In order to write that, I asked myself, well, who said it? The mayor. What did she say? Well, she's talking about security cameras and that they're a good addition to keep Starkville safe, right? And so the Starkville mayor, Susan Mayer, says this added technology will help keep the area safe. So I haven't used any of the words that she used within her quote, but I've previewed what she's about to say. That's how you write a lead-in sentence. So now that we've gone over the Butera chapters on how to write the lead, body, and tag, as well as lead in sentences, I want you to go into the discussion post, talk about the differences between print and broadcast styles of writing. Then you will go ahead and turn in your pitch to me for your radio story by Monday. And I want you to read an article that NPR produced on the essentials for writing for radio. Up in this week, we have talked about broadcast as an overall medium. So these rules apply for radio, podcasting, and television. So this article will introduce you to some of the ideas that are more specific to the style of radio. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.